Okay. So, apologizing again. We want to speak today about a very interesting state, I think, land that we, the recording is okay. That usually, yes, yeah, just a second. I'll say a few more general introduction words and then תודה רבה. So a very interesting place, which is Iraq and the far, what we call, what the English called, and we after them, the Far East. Now, the Far East, when you live in England, in Brittany, then it makes sense to call here the Middle East and India and China the Far East. Obviously, the people living there, or the people living here for this matter, there is no reason why we should call ourselves the Middle East. We are the center. But that's these, as you know, the usual names. So the Rab we'll speak about today, which is called the Rab, or as is the typical name in these places, Chacham, sage. So Chacham, and his Hebrew name was Ovadia, but his Arabic name was Abdallah, and that's how he was known. That's like the nickname. So Chacham Abdallah Somech. Somech is a Hebrew word, which means to rely upon, or something that you can rely on. And Rabbi Abdallah Somech, it seems, that's the theory that I read, that one of his great-grandfathers was a helper to the Chazan in Babel, which is the land about which you're going to speak. Babel means in nowadays Iraq. Back then, the whole thing was under the Ottoman Empire. So in Babel, they called the helper, the assistant to the Chazan in Shul, they called him Somech. So that seems to be how they got this last name. So Chacham Abdallah Somech, Rabbi Ovadia Avraham Somech. The shiur is dedicated Leilu Nishmat Rafael Moshe Ben Eliyahu Zichrono Livracha. Chacham Abdallah Somech was born in 1813 in Bagdad. So that is Iraq. What is the state of the Jews in Baghdad? As we said, it's part of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. So it really depends. It really depends. For sometimes they would think that their situation is pretty good and they are being treated, I mean, they were never treated equally, but that was not something that Jews expected anywhere during virtually all of history. So they were not in any way treated as equal, but it was doable to live there, which was the best that you can expect, or the best you can hope in most places, in most times. Sometimes that they felt that they are really doing great. And Rabbi Abdallah Somech himself is one responsa in which he speaks in similar terms. I would mention that later, Be'ezrat Hashem. But most of the time, it was not as good. The reason why it shifted so dramatically was because very much was dependent on the local pecha or pasha or governor. So the local governor would have, because the Ottoman Empire was, its central government was weak and weakening during the 19th century, it was left for the local pashas, for the local governors to basically decide about everything. So if on the throne sat someone that loved the Jews, that was very rare, or maybe loved money, that was more common. But if you loved money, then you usually loved the chicken that laid the golden eggs. All right, so you would love the goose. You would love the goose that lays the golden eggs. So you would love the Jews, and they would also help you love them by bribing you. That was the custom back in the Ottoman Empire. No one saw it as immoral to bribe the governor, because that was only a question of how much the other one would bribe him. And it was called bakshish. It was called very accepted practice. Now, that was in the good times. In the bad times, there would be someone who is anti-Semitic, mostly because of religion. And then money would not help you because ideology would be stronger than money, and you would suffer. So that's how things went, sometimes south and sometimes souther. So that's basically the times. Just to give you some general background. Here is from an introduction to the פירוש on the הגדה that Rabbi Abdallah Somech wrote at 1828. If you'd make a quick calculation, you'd see that if he was born in 1813 and he wrote his פירוש on the הגדה in 1828, that means he was 15 years old. So we had the manuscript. It was not printed during his life days. It was printed after his death. It's maybe he didn't think it is deserving of printing. Anyhow, it remained in, as they say, in the My Documents drawer up till his death, and then it was printed by his children. So the Agada is called Kibbutz Chachamim, and it is basically Kibbutz Chachamim means the gathering of the sages. And basically what he's doing there is to collect different pirushim from the Al-Sheikh HaKadosh and from others, and then he also puts his own spin on them, and that's how the Agada is a very nice pirush. The problem is that the Agada, that's a very contested area. So everything that you'd put out on the Agada, if you put something on, and no, on the keynote, then there is not so much rivalry. But if you put on the Agada, you know, you can have 5 shelves of Agadot of different pirushim. It was in Hebrew. Nice Hebrew, yeah. Nice Hebrew. Let's see the introduction also in Hebrew. ועוד אדרוש מן הקדוש ברוך הוא יתברך שמו. So as he finishes the introduction, he says, here it says אדרוש. So in modern Hebrew, it doesn't come good. It comes as I demand. But here what he means is, I would ask, I beseech. So I'm asking הקדוש ברוך הוא יתברך שמו, שיצילינו מידי הגוים ההרורים האלה אשר אנחנו ביניהם. He wouldn't write such a thing in Arabic, I guess. So he says, I ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu to save us from apologize for the language, but for the damn non-Jews, right, and them goyim that we live between them. Aכלונו, they ate us. הממונו, they hit us. It should be בבלאי. It's my mistake, my misspelling. בבלאי here in the computer, I can immediately fix that. Yes. בבלאי טפשאי. דאכלי ממונא דיהודאי. So he's rephrasing here a statement from the Talmud, and he's doing a little gameplay on it. But he says, these stupid Bavlai, these stupid Babylonians, these stupid Iraqis, who eat the money of the Jews, אכלי ממונא דיהודאי, ויאכלו אכול כספנו, and they ate all of our money, לא נצרכה האלה לשמלה. So we are only left with our clothes on our skin. זאת ועוד אחרת, לא די להם בממון, אלא מכים ועונשין שלא כדין וההלכה. Now it would have been bad enough if they would find it suffice to have our money, but they do not, they are not fine with that alone. They also hit us and punish us, not according to judgment, not according to the law. חבטונו במקלות חבית חבית. So they are hitting us with sticks. Hit and again. עשו סומין מן העין. They made our eye blind. רצו אוזנינו רציית עבד. They, I guess, made a hole in our ear as they do to a slave, right? An עבד נרצע. That they, what is the word? עושים חור באוזן. Pierce, thank you. They pierce his ear. או שבר יד או שבר רגל. They break our bones. זה חומס וזה רומס. One would steal and the other would step on us. הבט נא השם וראה. So God please see is quoting from איכה, כי הייתי זוללה, meaning I became a sheep in their eyes. So we see from here, so that's a guy 15 years old, and that's what he sees around him. So I think the words speak speak to themselves. Now, again, here he is emphasizing we call it the monetary problems. Obviously, there were more difficult periods in Jewish history, but it was bad. It was bad. Now, he's born to the Somech family. This was an important family. There were some Rabbanim, many rich people, Gvirim, that would support the community, and I guess a few Chazanim. Now, in the first 20 years of his life, although he was learning by one of the important Rabbanim of Iraq, who's called the Rabbi Abdallah, but anyhow, he was designating himself, and I think that was more or less what his family usually would do, to be a merchant. So the Iraqi Jews were known in the East as excellent merchants. And we would speak about it. It would take a large part of the story later, because these Jews would go as far as India, and later even to China, and we know some big Baghdadi communities that would be established in the Far East, and he became one of these merchants. So he's doing his work, and he's pretty much successful in it. But then we don't have the exact date, but around the age of 25 or 26, he's looking around and he's seeing that the state of Torah learning is diminishing. There are less Torah learners. The Rabbanim, I don't know that they are on a lesser madrega, but they are on lesser madrega. And the feeling is that the Baghdad community, which has its roots as far as the Talmud and earlier from the first destruction. So we are speaking about a very old, ancient, and important community. Things are falling apart. Now, we don't speak yet about the invasion of modernity and the collapse of Judaism as we know it from Europe at the same time. That's not what we are speaking about. The Ottoman Empire. Everything is frozen in the 16th century or 17th century. So we are not speaking here about modernity. We just speak about some type of decadence, we may say, of the Jewish Torah culture in this specific place in Baghdad, which caused, at least again in Abdallah Somech's eyes, it caused the diminish of the honor for Torah. People do not appreciate Torah anymore. They don't send their children to become Gdolei Torah. If there are no Gdolei Torah, then that's a magic circle. Then again, the Torah is not treated as important, and it's going down and down. That's what he was seeing. So he decided to leave his position as a merchant, as a businessman, as a socher, and instead he is beginning to teach. He's taking 10 young promising men that he feels would be able to take positions of leadership and Torah leadership in the next generation. And he says, I am putting my hand in my pocket from the saves I was doing while I was a merchant, and you can sit at my home and I will teach you. No, I require no payment, and I will try to fund you as best as I can. And that's how he begins his yeshiva from his own checkbook, and he was also helped by his brothers who remained rich and powerful merchants, which obviously also helped in the first years. So he's working with that. These 10 rabbis became later very, very famous, and some of the most famous rabbis in the East of the next generation would be the students of Rabbi Abdallah Somech. It is enough, I think, just to mention, for example, Rabbi Yosef Chaim, that is the Ben Ish Chai, who was a student of Rabbi Abdallah Somech. Rabbi Yaakov Chaim Sofer, who wrote the Kaf HaChaim, a very important halacha work, also a student of Rabbi Yaakov Sofer. Rabbi Yehuda Petaya, who became a very known Mekubal, also a student of Chacham Abdallah Somech. If you'd open the Wikipedia value of him, then they have a list of 20, 30 rabbis, all of them well known, at least in the circles of Eastern Jewry. And all of that is coming from this yeshiva that he is now establishing. Now, I found it very interesting in my own eyes, because many times we heard, so I'm now taking us to a different time, a different place, but I think there are lines of comparison which I would like to share with you. So I heard many times from Mori Rabbi Abdallah Somech, זכר צדיק לברכה. Why did he establish Yeshivat Har Etzion and basically began the Hesder Yeshivot movement? And one of the things that he would say again and again, that he saw that what we call today the Dati Leumi society or tzibur or segment would be left without Torah leadership. Why? Because the Haredim, obviously they had their own yeshivot and they would produce their own Gdolei Torahs, Baruch Hashem, they had in the last 75 years. And the people that were not interested in Torah leadership, well, they would not produce, and they did not produce Torah leadership because they are not interested in it. But the Dati Leumi people, they were in a very peculiar situation. On one hand, they were speaking as, at least, they value Torah leadership and they want Rabbanim, etc., etc. On the other hand, you do not establish the institution that would give such a leadership. So you are paying tribute in your words to something, but you do not put, as they say, you do not put your mouth, right, your hands or your feet where your mouth is, right? Or in our case, you don't put your checkbook where your mouth is. And he said it is important that we would have a yeshiva that would be fulfilling also the Dati Leumi ideals, that is by serving in the army and by being part of Israeli society, but on the other hand, keen on producing Torah leadership, keen on producing Rabbanim. So nowadays, when we speak about yeshiva, many times we speak, yes, the goal of yeshiva is to create your layman, right? Your Baal Habayit who is a lover of Torah. And that's obviously, it's important, it's an important goal. But when Rabbi Yehuda Mital began yeshiva, that's not how we were speaking about. What he was speaking about was how to create the Torah leadership of the next generation, people that would take the flag and walk with it. Because, and we spoke about it many times, the problem is in the modern world, and Rabbi Abdallah Somech is not exactly in this crossroad, but maybe he's beginning to envision it. In the modern world, you must have high institutions of learning. And this is something that for many, many years, it was preferable to have, but it was not crucial. Because as long as you have most of your education at home, so most of the education at home, you can rely on mimetic. You can rely on people just mimicking their fathers and appreciating what their fathers did, and daughters would mimic their mothers, and everything would more or less chug along. But when people are beginning to be educated outside of home, and there are modern school, public school, or secular schools, or even Jewish schools, but they are teaching secular learnings and values. If you do not put in someone's mind some counter arguments to that, then you are as admitting that all the rest of the things in the subjects in the world are important to learn to teach, and Torah is only for those of us that cannot succeed in any other field of life, which is what happens sometimes, right? That's who are the I do not say anything bad. My mother was a teacher for many years, but it is not, I don't think that it's a secret that I would say only that. The conditions to be accepted, I myself also have Rishayon Teudat Hora'ah, right, a teaching certificate. Now, the conditions to get, in order to get into the course, to be accepted, to be a teacher in this type of colleges, that's basically to have a pulse. If you have a pulse, then you are accepted. And yes, that's it. So, that is the truth. That is the sad truth. That is just a sad truth. And
the same thing which those that can't do, teach.
Yeah, exactly.
Those
and
that can't teach,
supervise.
Teach teachers.
Yeah, teach teachers. Yeah, exactly. And now he saw that, and he understood that would bring to disaster. We should all, I think that we all know that would bring to disaster. People would not respect values that they do not see embodied in anyone that is respectable. Why should they? Why should they? And you can have a very nice community, and they would be doctors, and rich people and many things. But if you do not grow this intellectual intelligence, right, this religious intelligence, then people would not follow it in the next generation, because all the bright, all the idealistic youth, all of them would go outside. They would go to seek something they respect. And so that was basically Rav Amital's vision. And from what I read about Rabbi Abdallah Somech, again, it's difficult, and I understand that I'm imposing here, maybe anachronistically, something that is, I mean, 80 years later. But nonetheless, it seems to me that he saw the same problem, and he understood that the solution is similar. And that is that if you see that the honor of Torah is diminishing, and you see that the young do not want to learn Torah anymore, so the answer to that is not by giving colorful books. I mean, it's good giving colorful books, but that's not the solution. That's not advancing us towards the solution. The solution must be building and putting such institutions of high learning that would give back the respect that Torah should have. So just like any one of us, I think, when he hears about someone that is a PhD in physics, I think that we are respectful of that, because we understand the difficulty that he had in achieving such a PhD, and we respect that, regardless of the question, how much money can you make in the market with a PhD in physics, which not necessarily always much better than a teacher or a rabbi. Many times these people, what they do afterwards is becoming teachers. But we respect it because we respect the effort he put into achieving that. And in the same way, he opened this Beit Midrash that was first called Midrash Menashe, after one of the Gvirim that was Menashe, that was supporting it. It later became, when in 1840, which is a very important year in many respects, so in 1840, there was someone there that his name was Yehuda, I think, and he saw how much Rav Somech is capable in teaching his students, that he bought for him a whole campus and built him a beautiful, beautiful yeshiva. Then it became Beit Zilka. Beit Zilka. Zilka was a last name by Iraqi Jews. It means Zecher leKohen Gadol. So people that are referring themselves and see themselves as affiliated with the Kehuna Gedola, they call themselves Zalika. To this day, there are some Jews that are called Zlika, Zalika, and that is Zecher leKohen Gadol. So it became Beit Zalika. I heard in one of the shiurim I was listening to in order to prepare this shiur. So the speaker had compared it, said that was the Howard of the yeshivot. So that was Ivy League. That was an Ivy League by itself. It was a very important yeshiva. In its prime, they had more than 100 students, but all of them very much selected. That's why they became afterwards, many of them became leaders of kehilot, of communities, and it was a very, very selective institution, and it was fully paid. You didn't have to pay anything. If you were found acceptable, then they would accept you, and you would get everything you need in order to sit quietly. They would have a monthly stipend, and they can sit quietly and learn Torah. So that was extremely important. People were very much, when they saw it, they were very much impressed. So there was some guy named Binyamin, he's called the Binyamin Hasheni, the second Binyamin. There was the first Binyamin Mitudela in the medievals, that was journeying around and writing his memoirs. Now, in the 1840s, there was another Binyamin. He called himself Binyamin Hasheni, the second Binyamin, and he also decided he's living, I'm sorry to say that, but he's leaving his wife and children at home and going around seeking for the 10 tribes. That was the official mission, and unfortunately he couldn't find them, and he died on the road. But he had left us some very important and interesting remarks about the Jewish communities that he had found on his ways. And in source bet, that's the short entry that he has for this Beit Midrash, Beit Zalika. He says, סדרי הלימודים, סוס ב', סדרי הלימודים בענייני הדת והאמונה, בין אחינו בית ישראל יושבי העיר הזאת, meaning בגדד, טובים מאוד. So the learning and faith of our brothers in Baghdad are very good. שם נוסד בית מדרש הרבנים. There is this yeshiva for rabbanim. Again, it was very selective, as I said, it was very, very clear, an elite institution. ובו נמצאים 60 תלמידים. So in his time there were 60 students. מחונכים להיות מורי הוראה בישראל. They are all designated to become הלכה teachers in the Jewish people. בית המדרש ההוא עומד תחת השגחת הרב החכם, כבוד הרב רבינו עבדאללה בן אברהם סומך, השם ישמרו ויצילהו, so obviously that's our hero, אשר העמיס העבודה עליו חינם אין כסף, as I said, he is heading the yeshiva, and he is taking no salary. הוא איש עשיר מאוד, he is a very rich man, אחד מהסוחרים היותר נכבדים בעיר, בית היותי שמה, when he was a merchant, as I said, he was doing very, very well, אשר עזב כל ענייני מסחרו ביד עוזרי ידו, so he left all of his merchantry, all of his business to his helpers, והוא בעצמו הקדיש כל איתו אל הדבר הטוב הנכבד ההוא, and he's putting all of his time into the yeshiva. So the way that he would answer questions, for example, he answered many, hundreds, maybe thousands of questions coming from all over the Ottoman Empire, as I said, East still China, and he would take the question, he would not answer by himself. He would sit with 10 of the students, or maybe sometimes more, and they would all compose the tshuva together. And there are many stories about his modesty, that he was willing, although he was the Rosh Yeshiva and a very respected man, if he saw, he had his opinion, and if he saw that one of his students had an argument that was convincing, he would change his opinion and change the psika accordingly. So that's a sign of greatness, I think. By Rabbi Abdallah Somech. He became known as Estai. Estai in Arabic means our teacher. So Morenu. And that was the name that they didn't say a name. They did not need to say Rabbi Abdallah Somech. They would say our teacher said, and everyone would know that it meaning Rabbi Abdallah Somech. He had a few very interesting questions coming from, as I said, the Far East. I would not begin to read them now because I was late, so we are a little late. I would say just by heart. So one of the questions was, for example, should we exempt? I mean, it was known that Torah scholars are exempt from paying the taxes of the Jewish community. That was given. But the question was that also Sofrim, the scribes of Sifrei Torah, should they also be exempt? And it seems from the question also that the children of the said sages and scribes were exempt. So the communities were beginning to ask, the community in Baghdad, that is, was asking Rav Somech, can we institute taxes at least on the children of the sages and on the scribes, the Sofrei Stam? That was the question. And he says in the beginning, he would have preferred not to answer because obviously I'm nogea b'davar, right? I have a hand in the thing. He himself, I'm sure that he was giving not by taxes, but he was giving charity all over. But nonetheless, obviously, it's something that it's difficult that he has to answer such a question that would directly affect his own affairs and his disciples. Nonetheless, he said there is no one else to give the tshuva, so I have to give the answer. And he says, it's very interesting, he says, Me'ikar adin, if we look only at halacha, then only the sages should be exempt, and even them in our days maybe should not be exempt. However, he says, because the minhag is that all of these people, the sages and the scribes and their children, would all have been exempted for many years, and it's not only the minhag of the Jews in Baghdad, also by the Ismailites, by the Arabs, when they pay the taxes, they exempt their sages and their scribes and their children, then it is inappropriate for us that we will tax these people if they are exempt by the Muslims. So that was basically his answer. So he says they should continue to enjoy this exempt. However, he says, obviously, if they are getting money from the community, they should know that they have responsibility to do their best, to learn their best, etc., etc., etc. So that's one, I think, very interesting answer that he is giving. Another interesting answer comes from Bombay. He has a responsa, a shoot. Most of it is focused on עניינים of שחיטה, of יודע, שחיטה and טהרת המשפחה, נידה, but he also has a whole book of questions coming from Bombay in all different realms of halacha. Now, one of these questions was about melichat basar, salting of meat. I don't know if anyone here had the fortune of salting meat, or that is something that, okay, some people still had it. Okay, some people still know how to do it. I mean, imagine that one day they would stop doing it in the butchery. I don't know what we will do. But so salting meat. The question was, for how long should you leave the meat in the salt? Now, that's not a new question, obviously, but there were different minhagim. Basically, what he says was that the minhag in Baghdad was an hour, but the Ashkenazic minhag was half an hour. Now, in Bombay, there was a clash because Bombay was ruled by the English. So Ashkenazic Jews were also coming in, and they bought the minhag of half an hour. And the Iraqi Jews were coming, and they bought the minhag of an hour. Now, some Iraqi Jews saw this minhag of half an hour, and they say to themselves, it's a very nice minhag indeed, that you have to wait only half an hour. So they wrote to Rabbi Abdallah Somech. It's a more complicated question, because in the beginning they didn't even know that there is a difference, so they were just going along with the Ashkenazi, at least that's what they tell, with the Ashkenazic minhag of half an hour, and now they ask if they have to return to the old custom of an hour. Now, you would expect someone that is so keen on the tradition of Baghdad, you'd expect him to bomb them. I say, of course you have to return, and that's the real minhag, etc. But that's not what he's doing. He's saying, you know, what is important in minhag is the community would be united. If everyone would keep half an hour with salting the meat, then that is fine, because there are roots, it's written in the Rema, halachically it's fine, and a community cohesion, people would be able to eat by each other. That's more important than keeping your old minhag from Baghdad. So if you would return to Baghdad, then obviously you'd return to your old minhagim. But as long as in Bombay that was the minhag accepted, then you can salt for half an hour. So next time you salt, please know that is allowed for half an hour. That was in source Dalet. I gave you the whole thing quickly. Another very interesting tshuva is about, well, you know, the Indians to this day, many of them are of the Elilim, right? They worship idols. That's what they do. They have small statues and they bow down to them and they sacrifice mincha to them. Now, some of them would get very offended if you tell them that they are worshiping idols. They would say, no, chas v'chalila. We are chas v'chalila. We are worshiping the divine side, the gods. They are only symbolized by the statues, but we do not care. If you bow to an idol, you bow to an idol. That's the end of the story. So that's what they did back then. That's what many of them still do. Now, the Jews coming from Baghdad, they were used to the Muslims. The Muslims are not idol worshippers. They worship one God who is immortal and does not have a body, etc., etc., etc. And suddenly they come, so there are many leniencies because they are not idol worshippers. And suddenly they come to India and there are many questions. So, for example, are you allowed to give them a gift before their holidays, which they would use to hang on their houses to enhance, right, their houses for the holiday of the idol? Are you allowed to do so? He says, yes, you are allowed. If they would not use it in the worship itself, if it's only for beautification, it is allowed. That is answer to them. And another question in the same venue is, are you allowed to get gifts? So it seems that in their holidays they would send gifts. The Indians, or the Indians, we speak about millions of people, hundreds of millions of people. So, but there were at least the sects back there in Bombay. In the holidays, they would give gifts. are you allowed to receive the gifts of fruits? And he says, mei vradim, that is roses water, rose water. Are you allowed to get that? He says, preferably not get the gifts. However, if it would cause hatred that you would not receive the gifts, then you are allowed. So the first answer, he says, no problem giving them, but getting from them, he says, that would preferably not, but if there is no other way, then you are allowed to get. The third question was, are we allowed to go and see their celebrations? And to that he says, no, with a capital law, right? With a capital N. You should not go to see their celebrations, neither in their holidays or in regular days. You should stay away from everything that resembles idol worshipping. So that was another. He says, if you are walking nearby and hear the celebrations, what you should do is, well, there is only an English word for that, krechten, right? You should krechts, and you should cry for the destruction of the temple. That's what he says, which I think is, again, it's very, for those of us that were born in other countries, it's a very interesting answer. It's a very interesting answer. He was very unique in his openness to modern culture. As I said, Ottoman Empire does not necessarily rhyme with modernity, but there were some modern institutions making ways into the Ottoman Empire. The Jews in France established a society which we spoke about a few times called Kiyach, Kol Israel Chaverim. There is also a French, so what is the French name? Alliance Française. Okay. Thank you. So I would not try to pronounce that, but the Hebrew name is Kol Israel Chaverim. Now, they were trying to create schools in which the Jewish children would be able to be educated and become real French. I mean, real Mensch. And as you know, the French, if they are Jews or non-Jews, they think that only if you know French and you are acculturated into the French culture, then you are considered beginning to becoming a human being. So they said, why won't we help these Eastern Jewish people to become a little more educated, and we would create these schools. Now, in many places, the Rabbanim, after understanding what they are being served, they greatly opposed these schools. Why? Because the schools, even when they had a kippah on their head, they were really agents of enlightenment, of Haskalah, of secularism, and they caused great damage. I mean, that must be said. It was not necessarily the goal of the people that founded the society. It was only a side effect for them. They were not really interested in that, but it was a side effect, and that is that it caused in many lands where they were able to create these inroads and create these schools, it caused, as you said, a diminish of Jewish culture, and that's the sad truth. Now, in Baghdad, it was very special and very unique that Rabbi Abdallah Somech said, yes, I want this school here, and I want to be completely involved in how to establish it. And that was the right, I mean, history has proved that was the right way to go, because he was so much involved. His son was a teacher there. He had a grandson that went to Paris to learn there. So he was so much involved that he was able to ride and tame the tiger. And so he was very open to modernity in that sense. He was willing to have new technologies. He was willing to learn and to read from non-Jews, philosophy, etc., etc., etc. But he said, and you can create the school and we will teach the children. But I would be responsible for who are the teachers and what is the curriculum. And the people of Kiev said, yes, of course, we'd be happy if you would give us an approval to the institution. Of course, we'd be happy to open it under your auspices. And that's what happened. That's what happened. And again, that was a very good model of how that can be done. So some modern questions that he had, and again, we are skipping here between things, but for example, what about a train on Shabbos? Now, there was no trains in the Ottoman Empire. So these are questions he was receiving from places which are more advanced, such as India, because who did rule India? The British. Now, the British were very much in favor of railroads in India, not because they wanted to improve, and the British would indulge me for that, but not because they wanted so much to improve the situation of the Indians, but because they wanted to get as much trade as they can from them. So railroads is very good for that purpose. So there are now trains in India. Are you allowed to go on a train on Shabbat? Because the train will drive anyway, right? It will go anyway. You do not make any difference by being on it or being not on it. Now in Europe, it was pretty much become, I mean, in the beginning there was some debates, but it became pretty much standard psika that you are not allowed to go into anything automatic that goes on Shabbat, because it's not uvdin, it's uvdin the whole. It's not Shabbat, it's not Shabbatik. And he is writing a tshuva, and he is knowledgeable of these tshuvot in Ashkenaz, and he rejects them and says, no, that is Shabbatik, because you sit like a king. Why should you walk? So he says, if it goes outside of the city, then you have a problem of tchumin that you are not allowed to take. But an inside the city, why not? It's beautiful. You go up on it and you don't have to walk. It says, don't use horse cars that you are not allowed to use, because you're not allowed to use a horse on Shabbat. But if it's a train with a locomotive, with an engine, why not? And that is psika. I mean, I have to say, this is psika. That's not how we paskin today. But it's very interesting. Again, it's very interesting. Now, one may claim that maybe if there was a train in Baghdad, you would have understood why it is not mat'im, right? It's not shayach. It is not acceptable on Shabbat. And just listening from hearing about it from afar, then you imagine something that is very quiet. Yeah.
I think there was a custom, a minhag in Indian Jewry, to sew a ticket behind their lapel, which they used to wear, and they used to show it to the conductor. Beautiful. Yeah, thank you so much. So they practice this psika. That's a testimony. That's beautiful. That the psika was adapted, and there was only a problem for otzah, right, of taking objects from one place to the other, so they sewed it into the cloth. I didn't know that. Beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So that was about trains. Another question: can you rely on the telegraph? So there are, in his lifetime, they installed telegraph in Baghdad. And let's say that a message is coming that someone unfortunately had died. Would you rely on the message of the telegraph to let his wife remarry? Would you rely on it to sit Shiva? Would you to get his Yerusha? So that was the question. Can you rely? The telegraph was like magic, right? You sit in one place and suddenly there are tin coming, most coming, and you'd have a message. You didn't see who sent it. Usually the sender would not be a Jew, because the man pressing the buttons was the officer of the telegraph of the government. So it's a goy. How can you rely on such an information being relied by a goy? And his answer was, you are allowed to rely on information coming by the telegraph. And again, we wouldn't read it because I'm way over time. But it's an amazing tshuva, because I would always say he's a mitlahev. How would you say mitlahev? Excited. He's excited, enthusiastic, exactly, about telegraph. About you see that he loves technology. It's interesting. He loves technology. He says, no, not necessarily very makely in everything. You have to know. In order to be, that's the Gemara says. In order to be makel, you need to know. In order to be machmir, you need to not know. I have to say, right? Only to say it's asur. That's easy. It's easier to say it's asur. That's right. But he also had some machmir psikot, by the way. But yeah, you're right. Psikot, I've collected here. I'm not sure, but okay, it's interesting. It's interesting. It was not my purpose to express it, so I'm not sure. So
he's saying telegraph, it's a beautiful invention, and the government, I am not sure where he's taking that from, but he says the government is responsible that everything coming from the telegraph would be credible. Otherwise, he says, we are taking monetary orders by the telegraph. So he says, if you imagine that we cannot rely on the telegraph, people are coming in, they telegraph their orders, right? By that, said that he's a merchant, he knows how it works. He says, if you do not rely on the telegraph, then all of our trade would collapse. Obviously, we rely on telegraph. He says, even sometimes there are orders coming from central government to impose or to lay off the minister. So sometimes the minister is being laid off by SMS, right, by the telegraph. So obviously we are relying on the telegraph. The government is responsible. It's a wonderful thing, and you can rely on it for everything, and that's it. He says it's just like the Jew that sent the telegraph is standing in front of you and giving a testimony. So he didn't know nothing, I guess, about fake news. I'm not sure that nowadays you would give such an importance to everything that is written in the telegraph is back then the news, right? So I'm not sure that you would give such credit to the news, but he was very enthusiastic about it. So it's again a very interesting tshuva. By the way, I'm looking in my mind into psikot in which is machmir. So there's one psik about which is machmir, and that is, can you put off fire on Shabbat? Now, in order to go to that, it would take us a long time, so I'll do it very, very brief. Don't rely on anything I'm saying now to halacha, because it's a complicated matter. However, the Gemara says, we're speaking only about cases in which there is no pikuach nefesh, but there is a house burning. The Gemara says you are not allowed to take off the fire, extinguish the fire, because it's not pikuach nefesh, so it's avera, it's isu. That's the Gemara. Now, it was accepted for 1,000 years, maybe more, that you are allowed to extinguish fire on Shabbat, even it's not pikuach nefesh and against the Gemara. How come? So, 20 laws is not enough in order to break the laws of Shabbat. However, they were worried that if the fire would spread, then the goyim would blame the Jews that they didn't put the fire off in the beginning, and that would create a pogrom. Now, that was a very real worry, and they used that in order to extinguish everything always. And that was a common practice for 1,000 years. And then came the Zivchei Tzedek, came Rabbi Abdallah Somech, and he says, nowadays we have a fire department. So it's not about the owner that is putting the fire anymore. It's the fire department. If they would, may I say, blow up, yeah, if they would not do their work as they should, then they would be blamed, not the Jews. And the part of that, it says, it's not as anti-Semitic as it used to be. So although all of what he wrote in the introduction, but he says, I don't think there would be a pogrom anymore. Now about that, unfortunately, he was not necessarily right. But he saw things as bright. And he said, so we should not extinguish fires on Shabbat anymore. If it's a pikuach nefesh, it's a pikuach nefesh. But if there is no pikuach nefesh, then we should let the fire rage. And if the fire department would come, they would extinguish it. But we are not allowed to take it to our own hands. So that's a psika in which again is looking at modernity and trying to see how halacha is reacting to modernity. And here it goes to the chumrah and not to the kula side. I would finish with a very famous story of his ptira. So he lived to the age of 76, 70, which is a very ripe age in that time. And then there was a pandemic, a cholera pandemic, and it caught him, and he passed away. However, the government did not allow him to be buried in Bagdad, in the central cemetery, Jewish cemetery, because they said everyone died during the pandemic. You are not allowed to bring him into the city. So he must be buried outside of the city. the Jews found a very nice burial plot that was called Kever Yoshua Kohen Gadol. I'm not sure if any Yoshua Kohen Gadol was never really buried there, but that's how they called it. There were a few Rabbanim that were buried there. So fine, they wanted to bury him there. Unfortunately, some Muslims there thought that this is the grave of some sheikh. And they said, how can the Jews contain, right, to impurify the place by burying their dead in such a holy place of Nebi Yoshua, they called it Nebi Yoshua. So there was almost a war during his Levite. There were thousands of Jews coming, and then came, I mean, these people came from the Misgad and from other places, and they were walked up by their Qadis. And they came with knives and with clubs and everything. And some people were injured. However, 6 Jews were able, young Jews were able to run quickly around with the bed of Rabbi Abdallah Somech and bury him quietly where they wanted to bury him. Now, that was a great bizayon. Such a rabbi should be buried in a very different atmosphere. But that was it was. It became even worse because the Muslims now turned to the Pasha and told him that the Jews had they are encroaching on this holy site of Muslims, and it became a very big thing because it caused pogroms, it caused a great stress between the Jews and the non-Jews. In the end, I'm skimming through the story. In the end, and after the French government and the British government became involved, and after the head of the community were imprisoned and tortured, it was very, very bad. The end of the story was that the Pasha was thrown away, and the Sultan made the following decisions. In order to appease the Jews, as I said, he laid off the Pasha. In order to oppose the Muslims, he said to the Jews, you need now to take out the rabbi from his grave and go and bury him in the central Jewish cemetery. They didn't want, obviously, to dig him. It's a great bizayon. It was 84 days after his death, after his burial. But they had no choice. They had no choice. And there was a second levaya in which they took the body out of the grave. Now they came with doctors coming in order to give, I don't know what they had there exactly, but like sprays against the smell, because they all obviously expected that the body would be in a very advanced state of rotting. But it was a great miracle because they took the body out and it was complete. And there are many, many testaments about this. It's really, I don't know what to say about it. It's very interesting. There are many testaments both by non-Jews and Jews to this event. Obviously it happened. And they took him to the Jewish cemetery and they reburied him there. Still, they were very sad, and the great maspid of him was Rabbi Yosef Chaim, the Ben Ish Chai, was also his great student, and he said that Rabbi Abdallah Somech was a gilgul, a reincarnation of Achaz Melech Yehuda. Now, he was not a righteous king at all. He closed the yeshiva. That's what the Gemara says. He closed the Batei Midrash in Eretz Israel. So said the Rabbi Yosef Chaim, that's why it was the tikkun of him that his neshama was given to Rabbi Abdallah Somech, who opened the greatest yeshiva of the Eastern world. And more than that, it says about Achaz that his son Chizkiah was dragging his body in order to humiliate him for what he did, in order for him to have a kapara. Said Rabbi Yosef Chaim, that's why we had all of these sad story about the kvura, the burial of Rabbi Abdallah Somech, because that's a reincarnation of Achaz Melech Yehuda, and by that he reached his final tikkun, and now the neshama can go into Gan Eden, and that gave the people the chizuk, right, and nechama, that they knew there was a reason for everything that happened. And that's the story of Rabbi Abdallah Somech. By the way, the yeshiva, the big yeshiva in Yerushalayim, some of you may be familiar with Porat Yosef, the yeshiva that Rabbi Abdallah Yosef led in. It's a very important Sephardic yeshiva. So that was created by Rabbi Yosef Chaim as a continuation of the big yeshiva in Baghdad. So the work of Rabbi Abdallah Somech is still, his legacy is to a great extent still with us, and we still enjoy the peirot, the fruits of what he had done more than 100 years ago. Thank you so much. I apologize again for being late, and Bezrat Hashem, we would improve next week. Excuse me, next week, because of the bar mitzvah we are having, there would be no shiur in the morning. My wife, that was a condition. So there will be no shiur in Sunday morning next week. So we would re-meet Bezrat Hashem 2 weeks from now. Have a good summer.
Right.